Great. Well, thank you very much. Really want to thank the organizers while we set up that for organizing this really interesting workshop. And I also learned a lot actually from the previous presentations. Is it okay now?
Do you need pointer on the screen?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I actually changed my topic a little bit because there was actually an experiment that we did recently that we just finished, and the results was actually quite interesting that I want to share with you all, and also actually love to get people's thoughts and feedback on this. Right. So in this experiment, I guess it's sort of a biological experiment in that we actually did it with 20,000 human reviewers, and we actually basically provided large language model feedback and assistance to 20,000 reviews. And also it's a randomized study. So there's another 20,000 reviews that did not actually get language model feedback. So I want to actually share with you what we actually learned from that randomized A/B study in terms of the impact of language models on the scientific publishing process, right? Both on the review process, but also on the paper itself. So I guess the context for this is that a couple of years ago, we started to notice this quite an interesting trend, right? So there we were actually just very simply looking at how often different words show up in different peer reviews, right? And you can see that there's actually a pretty notable spike, like words like commendable, just starting in 2024, became actually much more prevalent, right? Compared to before, right? They show up quite a bit now in these peer reviews. And many of these reviews are publicly available because we can get them from AI conferences and also from journals like Nature, where the reviews sometimes are shared. And what's actually common across all of these words is that these are also words that are much more likely to be used by large language models like ChatGPT, and this to be used by human reviewers. Right. So this gives us sort of the idea that we can actually build like just a statistical model based on the differential word frequency usages, right, between language model and humans, right, to basically quantify, given a piece of paper or given a piece of review, what fraction of the sentences, right, what fraction of the text actually written by AI versus by humans. So this eventually enabled us to basically quantify for different machine learning and AI conferences, essentially what we show here on the y-axis, like the fraction of the text in those papers reviews are actually written by a language model versus by humans, right? So for example, if I look at like this orange dot, which is one of the main NLP conferences, right? So you can see that basically we can estimate around 17% of all the text in all the reviews in that conference in 2024 are actually written by AI. And similarly, if you look at like NeurIPS, which is this green dot, right? So about like 10% in 2024, and then it's actually increased since then. So this actually was at that time quite interesting, a little bit surprising to us that there was actually already quite widespread usages of language models, right? And by reviewers, they help them to write different reviews. And maybe some people here have also used it when you write your own reviews. And we thought, okay, so maybe people are just using this to sort of a way to like proofread, right? To like help to polish their reviews. So maybe they'll write the first draft and then use the ChatGPT to basically correct typos. So to test that hypothesis, we basically take each of these reviews, right, and then just send it through the language model again to just ask it to correct for just surface level polishes like typos and grammar issues. And you can see that after we do that polishing, what we call proofreading, right? So there's actually not that much change in our estimator, which actually suggests to us that actually, a lot of the way that people are actually using this language model in writing the reviews goes much more beyond simply using these models to polish for the typos and surface mistakes, right? So people are actually really using them to do more substantial writings, which is actually potentially maybe more impactful. And we actually also have the timestamps of when each review is submitted. So here basically we see that across all these different conferences, the reviews that are more likely to use AI assistance also tends to be the ones that are submitted late or very close to the deadlines. Maybe, you can make your own inferences from that. And similarly, we have people have to report their confidence when they write these reviews, right? So we also see that reviews that also use more AI assistance tends to be the ones that will have lower confidence, the self-reported confidence. And finally, we can also quantify how often do the authors and reviewers interact during the rebuttal, the revision process, because all of that is actually publicly available, right? So we can, for example, quantify how often would the authors and the reviewers actually respond to the author's comments. And we can basically see here that there's a pretty consistent trend whereby the reviewers that actually use AI to help them write the reviews, they're also less likely to respond to the author's revisions or author's rebuttals. Right, so all of that sort of providing some sort of circumstantial evidence to suggest that, okay, so first, that people are actually already using a lot of language models in helping to write scientific reviews, right, for papers in CS or computational biology. And then second is that maybe people who are relying more on the AI also tends to be perhaps the less attentive reviewers. So this motivated us to really study, like, okay, so is there actually maybe perhaps more productive ways that we can actually have language models to help the reviewers, right, to improve the quality of the peer review process? So this led to the experiment, which I'll describe next, where we basically collaborated with this large AI conference. It's called ICLR. So ICLR is actually one of the largest AI conferences. They received here's basically the number of paper submissions they get every year. Last year they got over 10,000 paper submissions for this 2025 year. And then from these over 10,000 paper submissions, they have to solicit basically over 40,000 peer reviews. So we did this collaboration with ICLR, sort of a randomized A/B test, where for half of these 40,000 reviews, for 20,000 of these reviews, we actually randomly provide AI assistance based on an agent that I'll describe next. And for the other 20,000 reviews, they did not get this agent's assistance, right? And then because it's a randomized study, then we can actually try to quantify what is the impact of introducing this AI agent to help the reviewers in every aspect of this review process, from rebuttal period to the final outcomes. Sort of like a clinical trial to assess essentially the impact of AI in the scientific publishing. So here's basically how we designed our what we call this review feedback agent. So the goal of this R agent is actually not to write the review for the reviewer. So we want the human reviewer to basically write to the first draft of the review, and our agent is actually going to provide some suggestions to that reviewer. Right, so the agent is going to take as input the original paper that was submitted, and also the first draft of the review that's written by the human reviewer. And then the agent actually has a checklist that we constructed by looking over all the previous year's reviews. And the checklist basically looks for common limitations and pitfalls that are common in reviews. And the agent will actually go through that checklist, and then if it finds one of the limitations, then will provide like a feedback and suggestion to the author. Will be not to the author, to the reviewer. Right? So it will be an optional feedback, so the reviewer may ignore it, but if they choose to, then they can incorporate the AI's feedback and use that to update the review before that review is actually made public to the authors. So this work is led by 3 very talented PhD students in my group, Nithya, Mert, and Jake. So I want to give some concrete examples of the kinds of feedback that our agents provides to the reviewers. There are basically 4 common categories of feedback that corresponds to 4 common kind of limitations that we find in existing reviews. So one common limitation in reviews is that maybe sometimes the reviewers might have some factual misunderstanding about the paper, right? So for example, like here, maybe the reviewer has a comment that, okay, like in figure 4, there's no results about transformer models, and that's sort of a limitation for why they didn't like the paper. And it turns out that the feedback agent actually here found that there's another figure, right, figure 5 here, that actually had transformer results, right? And then maybe that's something the reviewer had missed, right? So it actually provides this feedback to the reviewer, like maybe can you double check this other figure to see if it actually answered the original question, right? A second common limitation in reviews is that often reviewers might give the comments like, oh, this work is not kind of incremental, it's not very novel, or it's not very, it's kind of vague comments, right? And like, here's like an example of this kind of generic criticism, like maybe it says, okay, this different parts of this work has been previously considered separately, right? And that kind of comment is maybe kind of frustrating to the authors. Like you don't know really how to respond to that kind of generic feedback. And then here the agent is supposed to tell the reviewers, suggest the reviewers that, okay, if you're going to say that, then can you actually cite and reference what specific previous works are you talking about, right? So that gives some more concrete targets for the authors to respond against. And also very common feedback we see, very common thing we see in these reviews is that often the reviewers say this work is not novel. And that's also can be quite vague to the authors and also quite frustrating. Right? In this case, the feedback that our agent will provide to the reviewer basically suggests to the reviewer, like, can you actually also give some more specific context for why you think this work's not novel? If you think it's not novel, can you also provide examples of the closest papers and their similarities? Right? So that also makes the review more informative. So the last category of things is that sometimes these reviews might have sort of unprofessional or sensitive comments, right? Maybe, and this is a real comment, and the reviewer says that, oh, the authors don't really understand what they're doing, right? And that's also not very nice. So here the agent is basically to provide a nudge to the reviewer, say, can you rephrase this to not talk about the author's intent, but really try to make it more professional. So in each of these cases, right, so the agent is actually designed to not really change the review itself directly, but to provide these comments that are optional, but sort of nudges to the reviewers to try to make the review more professional and more detailed and helpful to the authors. And just under the hood of the agent, there's actually multiple language models. We basically actually have 5 different language models to essentially look at the review and look at the original paper and then summarize all the different information and then also provide it into like a nice format that can be provided to the reviewers. Right. So the whole process is relatively fast, and it costs us a few cents to actually provide each feedback. So it's fairly scalable. So in the remaining few minutes, I want to basically share with you, now that we understand this setup of the agent, basically what did we learn actually from this large-scale randomized study experiment. So with iClear, again, it's one of the largest AI conferences in this past year. So they just finished a couple months ago. So iClear actually received about 44,000 reviews this year. And then for half of these reviews, we actually randomly selected to actually receive this feedback agent's feedback. So this is about 22,000 reviews. The way that the feedback is given to the reviewer is that the reviewer actually provides an initial draft, and then they'll basically get a real-time, almost instantaneous feedback from the agent. It happens within an hour. And then the reviewer basically have an option to go back and then update their review based on their feedback if they choose to. They may also decide to ignore the feedback or not update. And then after a couple of days, then those reviews will be actually made public to all the authors. And then the rest of the rebuttal period will actually go on as before, right? So it's basically a one-time feedback, one-time intervention that's provided by the agent. Right? So the agent doesn't really intervene during the decision-making process toward the second half. And what we found here, it's kind of an interesting statistic, is that about 27% of the reviews that actually received the AI feedback, they did actually go back and update the review, right? So a bunch of the time, reviewers are busy, they just ignored the feedback, but actually a good number of them actually did bother to go back and update the review. So here's basically what we show is essentially the top part. Basically, I show the number of reviews that are actually submitted as a function of time, right? So you actually see a big spike, and not surprisingly, when the spike happens, is basically the deadline of when they're supposed to submit the review. But then you also see a bunch of reviews are actually submitted after that deadline, so that a lot of reviews are late. In the bottom here, basically, we show essentially at each time point what fraction of these reviews that receive the AI feedback, what fraction of them actually update the review based on the AI feedback, right? So you can they start off being pretty high, around 45%, right? And then you can see that actually the update rate also drops as you get closer to the deadline, which is also not surprising, right? As reviewers get busy, then they also are more likely to ignore the AI suggestions, the AI feedback. But overall, we're quite pleased that almost 30% of the reviewers actually did go back and update the review based on the AI suggestions. So actually what happens then when these reviewers actually update their AI based on the AI feedback? So we found that altogether, over 12,000 AI specific feedback suggestions were actually incorporated in the update reviews. Right. And the reason why we know this is that we actually have the time trace, so we know the original review that was posted and also the updated review. So we can actually do a diff between them and see what was actually changed, and then compare that diff with the AI feedback to say, is that diff actually correspond to a specific AI suggestion? Right, so this actually tells us about 12,000 reviews are actually incorporated. And then as a result of this, actually the length of this reviews became quite a bit longer by about 80 words after the update. We did like a blinded human evaluation where we found that about almost 90% of the time, the human researchers actually preferred the review after it's gone through the AI update compared to the original review before the AI update, right? So to them, they actually found, to the researchers, to the authors, they actually found that the AI feedback has actually made the review more informative and sort of more fair, higher quality. We also found that there's a sort of an interesting effect that, whereby the authors, after they received this AI feedback, they became more engaged during the rebuttal discussion period, right? So basically, the reviewers who had received the AI feedback, as we saw, they wrote longer reviews, but they also actually end up writing longer responses to the author's rebuttals, right? So the author would write a rebuttal, and then the reviewer get a chance to comment on those author rebuttals. And we actually also saw like a significant increase there. And they were actually a little bit more likely to actually update and change their scores during this rebuttal periods, which perhaps suggests that they might be more engaged and also more responsive to the authors. And because this is actually a randomized study, right? So we know these are actually a causal effect, right? So this actually, the AI feedback is actually causally leading to increased engagements by the reviewers. What's also interesting is that as a result of having these more engaged reviewers, so the authors also have to write a little bit more, right? So they end up also writing a little bit longer responses, longer rebuttals. And in the end, there's actually no difference in the final acceptance rate. And we view that as actually as a good result, right? Because the goal of the feedback agent is actually not to advocate for the paper or to disparage the paper, right? It's not supposed to be fairly neutral. It's not meant to actually really influence the final decision systematically in one way or the other, right? Just try to make the review process maybe more transparent and more informative. And in accordance with that, we actually did not see any significant change in the final acceptance rate between the papers that actually had this AI feedback to the review process and the papers that did not. Okay, so just to summarize all of this, right? So first we saw that from the statistical modeling, we actually found that there is evidence for quite widespread usage of large language models by reviewers, right, to help them to write reviews. Right? And then in this recent study with ICLR through this large-scale assessment, we think that there is actually a way to use these language models in the peer review process that potentially can have some benefits. But the benefits including enhancing the review quality and also increasing the engagement rates between the reviewers and the authors. And I want to especially thank again my students, Nitya, Mert, and Jake that led these projects, and together with Carl, who is the PC chair of ICLR this year. And I'll just end by showing you sort of like a new experimental conference that we're running as sort of as a follow-up to this. We're running this new conference where both the authors and reviewers are AI agents, right? So you have to be you have to be AI to submit the paper, and then also for the review process, we'll also have AI to review these papers. And in the end, we'll have human experts to do the final assessment and selections. But the idea of this is that currently there's no venue like where you can actually have an AI first author that submit that paper, right? You cannot have AI written paper submitted to ISMB or to Nature, right? And that makes it very hard for us to understand what is the actual capabilities of AI as a way to do real science as a main driver, right? So we thought we'll have this experimental conference where sort of the opposite, where you have to be an AI to submit the paper. You can have a human co-author, but the AI has to be the first author. And then the review has to be done by AI as well, so that we can learn about what is the strength and weaknesses on both sides, right, of the AI authors and also the AI reviewers. So it's sort of an interesting experiment. So I encourage you that, if you take your favorite AI agent, Cloud Code, or whatever, right, you can get your agent to help you write a paper and submit to the conference, and then we'll see what happens at the end. We'll actually have some human experts, including some Nobel laureates, to help us to do the final assessment of these AI written papers. Great, so I'll stop here and happy to take any questions.
Any question? Can go here. Oh, okay.
James,
Let me.
I think this is enhanced review, peer review system is really great. It's really what I think it's needed right now for publication and grant review process. So has anybody from IH talked to you about possibly they can improve the peer review process. Also, what about the journals? For the reviewers, can they use some AI assisted approach to help improve their reviews as well?
Yeah, thanks for that. We're very interested in working with the grant agencies. And we had some discussions, for example, with CCI on working with them on that. One of the challenges with the grants is that there are very few publicly available grant reviews, unlike papers where some of the reviews are actually public, so we can use that to train the agents and to validate it. But there's much less public data for the grants. That's one of the challenges we're working through. And we're also very interested in working with different journals. So for example, Barbara Schiffet, who's the head editor of Nature Biotech, is actually one of our partners for this new experimental conference. So we're actually working actively with these different journals to see, we run this experimental conference as sort of a standalone thing once, but then we can work with these conferences and see how can we actually incorporate what we find here into the more mainstream journals.
Okay.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. I have a kind of weird question because a lot of your AI comments was trying to be nicer and trying to be more constructive. Do you also instruct AI agents to be more harsh to the authors? Like, for example, you missed this citation even though the reviewers didn't point it out, or you only did one experiment on one data set, but actually you should do more experiments. I often feel like sometimes people, authors did not cite a paper because the reviewers should have, told the authors, oh, you actually should have done more research. Actually, I found the paper that you should cite, which is very similar to your work or something like that.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So here we intentionally limited the agent to mostly comment on things that are in the actual paper itself, rather than to bring in external information, just to avoid risks of hallucinations, right? We don't want the agent to actually hallucinate a new reference and have the author to put that in. And I think what we do find here is that actually the final acceptance rates, the reviewers basically, they did change their scores. They're more likely to change their scores, but basically half of that has been up, and the other half of the reviews scores actually been down. So it's not that the reviewers are systematically biased by the agent to be more positive. So sometimes the agent asks the reviewer to provide more information. The reviewer thought about that more and ends up lowering the score because now they actually spent more time thinking about why this work is not novel, and provided more detailed evidence to support that argument. Right. So we really designed the agent to be sort of a neutral, informative, but a neutral party in the peer review process in this iteration.
Okay. Thank you very much.